Paleo Runner Podcast is devoted to finding better ways to live, run, train, and eat. I'm your host, Aaron Olson. You can find more information by going to paleorunner.org. If you enjoy the show, please go to iTunes and leave a review. Search for Paleo Runner in iTunes and click Ratings and Reviews. You can also follow me on Facebook.com/RunPaleo or on Twitter @RunPaleo. I wanted to take a minute to let you know about a product I've been using called 3Fuel. 3Fuel is a sports drink that gives you fat, protein, and carbohydrates to use as a fuel source. Unlike sugary sports drinks, 3Fuel gets absorbed slowly into your bloodstream to give you sustained energy throughout your workout. If you'd like to give it a try, you can get 10% off by using the coupon code 3FOLSON. Go to paleorunner.org and click 3Fuel at the top of the page. If you're listening through the podcast app on iPhone, click the link displayed on the app right now. My guest today is Dr. Phil Maffetone. Phil is author of the Big Book of Endurance Training and Racing and has coached triathlon grades such as Mark Allen, who is a 6-time Ironman world champion. Phil, thanks so much for being part of the show.
Aaron, thank you. It's great to be here.
Well, Phil, you have a really interesting background in music, in nutrition, in chiropractic, and in endurance training. Can you give our listeners a little bit of a background of how you first got started in running?
Well, I began running in high school in the 60s and did it because I suddenly realized that I was the fastest kid in gym class. And that kind of launched me into trying out all different sports, which I seem to excel in quite well, except for basketball, even though I'm 6 feet. At the time, I was one of the tallest guys in the school, but I just didn't like basketball. But I ended up running barefoot some of the time because it felt better and I was faster, and I ran in college as well, and when I realized I wanted to get into school and become a doctor and help people, it was with sports medicine in mind, and of course that led me to look at nutrition and the dietary intakes of athletes, and then when I got into private practice, that's how I went about working with athletes. And then I early on in practice, basically right away, I realized that people were coming in with injuries, and I would help them with their injuries, and that seemed fairly easy to do. But then they'd go out and train and come back either with the same injury or have a new one, and I realized that I needed to participate in their training as well, and otherwise, I was just treating symptoms, and I didn't want to do that. So I out of necessity, became a coach.
Okay. So you said that you started out as a sprinter, and you also did some barefoot running. Was that unique at the time to be a sprinter running barefoot?
I think it was. I didn't. It just seemed like a natural thing to do, and I don't recall anyone else doing it. But I also don't recall whether there were any issues about it. I remember at a track meet somewhere, I was at the starting line. I did run in spikes at times, but in this one particular race, I was at the starting line, and the official said, "You have to wear shoes." And I said, "Why?" And he said, "You have to wear shoes, or you can't race." So I had to put on shoes. But other than that, I don't know. I just seemed to naturally drift toward being barefoot, and of course, growing up, I lived in the country for much of my childhood, and growing up, being barefoot was sort of normal, and I remember many times going out on my bike for a ride, not having shoes on as well.
Mm-hmm. And in the introduction to your book, you tell a story about how one day, it sounds like you've always had a interest in exercise and a natural way of doing things, but you just decided, you know what, I want to become a physician of chiropractic, and that's what I'm going to do. And it sounds like you had a good job at the time, but within about 2 weeks, you actually decided to go to chiropractic school in Chicago and totally make this whole lifestyle change. How did that come about? You said that you had an epiphany. What happened in that situation?
Yeah, I had gone to college for only one reason, and that was to run track, and I had some goals I wanted to reach, and making it to a national class level, and when I attained that goal, I quit college. I literally quit the next day, actually. I found a job with a phone company, and it was a good paying job and all that kind of stuff. And Got married, started a family. I mean, my life was underway, and I didn't see that I was going to do anything else, and I was quite happy with what I was doing. But one day I came home from work, and I sort of had it was just a strange reaction. It was sort of like everything turned white, and I had this momentary glimpse of doing something else in my life. And as I found out later, I was actually sitting on the lawn in front of my apartment for 45 minutes. It seemed like just 45 seconds. And when I came out of it, I realized I had to go back to school and become a doctor of some type and help people. And I gave my 2-week notice the next day. It was such a powerful experience. And so 2 weeks later, I left my job and went back to school.
Mm-hmm. And then after you had gone to chiropractic school for a few years, you started to realize that you said that it was sort of a limited practice and you wanted to take a more holistic approach. So you just started treating people in your apartment as they would run by. You saw one guy and he looked like he was struggling and you asked if you could treat him. So what was it about chiropractic that was limited, and how is your approach different?
Well, I think it was actually after only a couple of weeks of being in school. I had moved my family from New York to Chicago and was very excited to start this curriculum at the chiropractic college there. But after 2 weeks, I realized that this was very limited, and I actually called my old boss back to see if I could get my job back again, and he said sure. But the curriculum was limited. The chiropractic teachings were too limited to treating the spine as the cause of all disease and injuries, and that just didn't make sense to me. I knew there was more. There was nutrition. There was exercise. There were mental, emotional things. There were the brain. The brain controls everything. It's not the spine. So I had a problem with that, and then I happened to run into a kinesiology class that was going on, and realized that was something I needed to learn, and much of that I needed to learn away from the college. Postdoctoral courses were plentiful around the country, and I found myself sometimes twice a month or more flying to some seminar to learn osteopathic technique and nutrition and exercise physiology and things that I wasn't going to learn too much about at the college. So that got me into this holistic scenario that I maintained and still today maintain, and still today learn more and more about.
Mm-hmm. So at what point, as you were learning more and more, did you start working with athletes, and at what point did you meet Mark Allen?
Well, I started working with athletes when I was a student, and then it just continued into my practice. And I got into practice in 1977 and started working with. I was in a small town in New York, in the New York City suburbs, and I started working with a lot of the local runners, and that soon, as I got more and more referrals, got me to seeing runners from New York City, working with the New York City Marathon people, and gradually started seeing other runners, and then I started doing workshops around the country. And I did a workshop in San Diego in 1983, and at that workshop were some of the great triathletes to be, Colleen Cannon, Paula Newby-Fraser, Mark Allen, and some others. And as I started working with these people with the intent of, teaching them about diet and nutrition and training and that kind of stuff, I never intended on becoming a coach, but the athletes were interested in continuing on an ongoing relationship, and coaching was a big part of that. So it just sort of it kind of led me in that direction. In the case of Mark, I think what got his attention was that he had a calf injury, and I was able to correct it that weekend, and he was able to go out and race, actually won a race that he wasn't going to even be able to participate in. And that got his attention, and he realized that, this was a way for him to get into better shape and stay healthy and injury-free and make progress in what then was this new sport of triathlon.
Mm-hmm. Something I found interesting in the beginning chapters of your book was how you talk about the difference between fitness versus being healthy, and you mentioned how you started working with New York City marathoners, and after you ran your first marathon, you looked around and you saw all these people at the finish line laying on cots and being taken away in ambulances, and you said, is this really what health is all about? Talk about what the difference between fitness and being healthy is.
Yeah, that was another epiphany that I encountered and learned from. There's this issue about being healthy, and health is a state where all the different systems of the body are working together. There's sort of a harmony, a balance throughout the body, and the muscle system, the nervous system, the digestive system, and the hormonal system, and so on and so forth. All these systems have to work together, and when they're in this perfect harmony, we have optimal health. We may not really ever achieve perfect health, but we can keep working toward it. It's something I still do today. But that's different than fitness. Fitness is the ability to be athletic, and it's relative to whatever it is you want to do. If you're a 10K runner and you want to be more fit, you're going to be faster. And if you could run a 10K in 40 minutes, you're more fit than when you were able to run a 10K in 50 minutes. So the 2:20 marathoner is more fit than the 3-hour marathoner. But they're different. And the problem that I was seeing was that many athletes were striving to be more fit but neglecting their health. And we ended up with, throughout the world, a lot of athletes who are fit but unhealthy. And the easiest way to see that is that there's so many athletes who could run well, either distance or short-term speed, or both, and yet they're injured, they're sick frequently, and that's a classic example of an athlete who's fit but unhealthy. And without health, we really can never achieve our optimal performance capabilities.
Mm-hmm. You mentioned in the book something called the Massatone method, and to me it sounded like a way of training that allows your body to burn more fat and to function at a higher aerobic level at the same heart rate. Can you talk a little bit about what that method is and maybe how you incorporated that with some of your athletes?
Yeah, it's something I learned early on. The Massatone method was the name of a book that McGraw-Hill published. I can't even remember the year, but it was more than 10 years ago. And it's an old book. I really don't recommend it. It's still out there. I recommend the big book of endurance training and racing because it's fairly new and it has literally 10 times the amount of information in it. Mm-hmm. But anyway, the Massatone method has kind of stuck as a phrase, as a name for what I do. But with endurance sports and actually all sports that have a fair component of endurance in them, which includes most sports, from basketball to motorsports and even baseball and hockey, and I work with all those athletes. Endurance, the key to being a better endurance athlete is to be able to burn more body fat as a source of energy. We burn both fat and sugar all the time. Right now, you and I are talking, and we're burning a certain amount of fat and a certain amount of sugar. And the key with endurance sports is to get the body burning more fat and have less reliance on sugar. And by doing so, you'll be able to run faster and farther. And if we use a heart rate as a guide, which I started doing as soon as I got into practice, actually, we can show that an athlete can actually run faster at the same heart rate as the months go by, if the body's healthy. When the body's not healthy, that may not happen.
Okay. And you also talk about how the food you eat can affect quite a bit what fuel you're using during your run. So if you're eating, say, a high carbohydrate diet all throughout the day, you're probably going to burn mostly sugars during your run. Whereas if you include a little bit more fats, you'll be burning more fats. Is that correct?
Well, that's generally correct. The bottom line is that refined carbohydrates will impair fat burning. It'll impair fat burning during your run. It'll impair fat burning throughout the day when you're working. It'll impair fat burning when you're sleeping. And the process of fat burning should be going on all the time. And it's such a powerful factor, the refined carbohydrates, that even just one meal of refined carbohydrates can literally significantly turn off the fat burning mechanism. As an example, for a while, I was able to, it's not difficult to measure fat burning and sugar burning. All you got to do is find a lab where they can measure your oxygen uptake and your carbon dioxide output. They put you on a treadmill, they put this tube in your mouth, and you run, and they analyze your gases, and from that you get there's something called respiratory quotient, and that tells you how much fat and how much sugar you're burning percentage-wise. Mm-hmm. And when we would test somebody, it was so obvious. It was really night and day, the difference between an athlete who had carbohydrates for breakfast before the test and those who did not. Those who had carbohydrates for breakfast, even as part of a healthy meal. So if you had, eggs and vegetables and a couple of pieces of refined carbohydrate toast, that was enough for most people to impair fat burning significantly, to be noticeable during the test, versus a person who would have the same meal without the toast. And it was so dramatic that it changed my general recommendation, which before that was sure you can get away with having a little bit of refined carbohydrate if you tolerate it, and small amounts in moderation, it should be okay. And I realized that it only took one meal, it only took one snack, it only took one power bar, that you eat in the morning before your run or before your race, to impair fat burning, impair endurance, and impair speed in the case of racing.
Really? So did you use a higher fat diet when you were working with Mark Allen?
Oh, I did. And I don't like to call it a high fat or a higher fat diet. I don't even like calling it a diet. Okay. I've been asked about, how long have I been following paleo, or how long have I been on a high fat diet, or how long have I been recommending high-protein diets? I've never recommended diets to begin with. What I recommend is that people find the healthy foods that make them feel the best. And in no way will that include refined carbohydrates. People, especially when they're addicted, which is really part of the problem, will say, well, I need some refined carbohydrates because I feel better. My body craves them. Well, you crave them because you're addicted. And every time you consume some, it impairs your health. And why would anybody want to do that, especially if you're trying to be a better athlete? Mm-hmm. So from the beginning, as a student, I learned, and I think growing up in the 60s and realizing, what a healthy diet was versus what junk food was, I realized that for me it was very important to stick with healthy food. But as soon as I got into practice, my recommendations were always to consume a good amount of healthy fats, because they were the only source of various nutrients that were necessary for good health and for fitness, and to consume a good amount of healthy protein, and the healthiest ones were from animals. And fruits and vegetables were sort of the foundation of the diet, and so that was sort of the philosophy I had from the beginning. Whether someone calls that paleo or in the beginning, I remember talking to my old friend George Sheehan, who's no longer with us. But I was talking to George about the style of eating that I was recommending, and how I ate. And he said, "Oh, that's the caveman diet." So, the paleo diet years ago was called the caveman diet. And I said, "George, I don't like calling it a diet. It's a way of eating that's healthy. It's the way humans should be eating, and there's no real question about that. It's it's just a matter of re-educating in the case, because the food companies have created so much propaganda over the years that we've been miseducated. So we have to kind of re-educate people in that regard. So I've been sort of eating that way my whole life. I've just gotten stricter as the year went on, especially early on, because I realized that the body is very delicate, and if you put something in it that it doesn't like, it's gonna let you know, and you need to be able to listen to that.
Mm-hmm. So you talked there about refined carbs and how those can really have a detrimental effect on fat burning. And what a lot of people think that, well, whole grains are an okay carb because they're slowly released, maybe, or something like that. What is your view on whole grains? Will that impair fat burning?
It certainly will. In many cases, in most cases, the problem is that when people talk about whole grains, the majority of people think that the foods that they're getting are whole grains, and they're not. So if you go into a deli and buy a bran muffin, that's just white flour with caramel color added, and there's nothing whole grain about it. If you go in the store and buy a loaf of bread that says whole wheat bread, in 99% of the cases, that's just refined flour that's high glycemic. And the glycemic index is really an important factor here, because that's the index that measures the amount of insulin we release when we consume the carbohydrate. And that's the problem with carbohydrates, is that we produce a lot of insulin as a result. So most of the so-called whole grains that are in the marketplace are really not whole grain. They're just called that. If you go to the store, and this is not something that's easy to do, most people have never seen wheat berries. They wouldn't know what they were if you had a bowl of them on the table.
Mm-hmm.
But if you go to the store, if you go to a health food store that has wheat berries, which would be hard to find, and you grind that up and make your own bread, some people may tolerate that. Many people will not, because in addition to it being a starch that's difficult to digest, many people have mild to moderate to even severe allergies to wheat. It's a very common problem. So I think the diet should be built around other healthy, natural food items rather than whole grain.
Mm-hmm. So how about when you're out during running a marathon and you take a swig of Gatorade or something like that? Is that going to impair performance? Would you recommend using? Go ahead.
That's a good question, and it's really the question that people ask when I say don't eat any refined carbohydrates. They say, what about during training, during long training, or right after training, or during a race, or immediately after a race? And in most cases, what they're saying is, I need to eat carbohydrates because I'm addicted, and when can I do it?
Uh-huh.
And I just don't want to play that game. There is a time in a race when consuming a source of carbohydrate can maintain fat burning, and the way to do that is not the way most people do it. The first thing that has to be done is you have to be able to increase your fat burning capabilities so that you can go out and train for more than an hour, or more than 2 hours, or more than 3 hours without needing any extra source of carbohydrate. And many people can't do that. Many people can do an hour, but to do 2 hours or more, many people don't have the energy for that. And the reason they don't have the energy is because their fat burning capability is not what it should be. It's diminished, and that needs to be worked on. The diet will help that, and the training will help that. And once you can get your natural fat stores to give you a lot of energy in a long training run, and even a long anaerobic training run, then you can top that off in a race with small amounts of carbohydrate during the event to maintain fat burning. And the carbohydrates I recommend in that case, which I discuss in the book, is a 6% carbohydrate solution, preferably using monosaccharides, because they don't need to be digested. Monosaccharides would be something like fruit juice, and I don't recommend citrus, but apple juice or grape juice is good for that. Or honey, which is a monosaccharide sugar that doesn't require digestion, and that can be very, very helpful. If you consume Gatorade in a race, or Coke, or virtually all the the goos and the carbohydrate supplements that are out there in the market and are on race courses today Most of them are not monosaccharides. Most of them are disaccharides. Some are even starches, but most are disaccharides, which have to be digested. And the indicator that you're consuming and this is something you have to do in training. Once you're able to generate more energy from fat, you need to experiment on some kind of drink that you're going to use in your race to see how it works. And the indication that it's not going to work is that it gives you bloating and indigestion or diarrhea. That means your body doesn't want to handle that stuff.
And you talk about that the amount of carbs that a person can tolerate is different from person to person. Someone might be able to have 150 or 200 grams of carbs a day and be perfectly fine. But then there's, sometimes I go to marathons and I'll see maybe a quarter of the people are overweight, and does that indicate that they might be carbohydrate intolerant?
It does indicate that, and that's a good observation on your part. I don't know where the percentage is. Is it 25%? I went to my first race last summer here in New York, where I am right now, in Syracuse, at a half Ironman race. And it was the first race I went to since, I think, Mark Allen's last race, which was quite a long time ago. And I was shocked at the number of overweight people. I refer to it as overfat. That way we don't have to deal with weight and what's the cutoff, and is it overweight, and what is obesity, and it's basically when the person has too much body fat because they're not able to burn that fat. And I was just shocked at the high percentage of competitors, and we're not talking about spectators, but competitors in the half Ironman event who were significantly overfat, many of them. So it's a problem. We have an overfat society, and 75% of our society worldwide is overfat. And the problem has crept into sports and has been doing so for many, many years. And these are people who are carbohydrate intolerant and who believe that since they work out a lot and burn a lot of calories, they can eat carbohydrates because they'll burn it away. Well, that's a real misnomer. That's not how it works.
I'd like to turn our attention a little bit to the training aspect, and you talk about two forms of systems in the body, the aerobic and the anaerobic. And from what I got from reading your book is the idea is to build sort of like an endurance space of aerobic training, and then maybe 6 to 8 weeks of more anaerobic training. Is that correct? And could you go into a little more detail about how that works?
Yeah, that's the most important part for an endurance athlete is to build the aerobic system, and the aerobic system is what provides us with the energy for our race. 98, 99% or more of the energy we need in an endurance event comes from the aerobic system. So why would you not want to spend most of your time developing that system? And indeed, that's the best way to do it. Then if you accomplish that after so many weeks and months, a period that my friend Arthur Lydiard called the base building, that's a period where you should be able to develop the aerobic system, increase your ability to burn fats. You're literally converting fat to energy, and the more you can do that, then the faster you can run at the same heart rate. And once you've done that, then the question is there time and energy to do anaerobic activity? Because you're going to get so little out of it, and the risk of anaerobic training is relatively high. When an athlete gets injured, it's usually the anaerobic muscle fibers that get injured. And those injuries, those muscle injuries, then cause joint injuries or ligament injuries, tendon injuries, or other muscle injuries. But it's usually the anaerobic fibers. So they are the vulnerable ones from a standpoint of getting injured. So do you want to risk an injury for a little bit of gain in speed and also risk creating more stress? Because anaerobic training is a stress. It's not unlike work stress or personal relationship stress or the stress of wearing improper shoes or any other stress. And so do you have time in your life schedule for more stress? And the answer for most people is no. There's no time for stress. I don't have the energy to do anaerobic work, and the return, the risk reward relationship just doesn't make sense for many people. And I've had plenty of people, including Mark Allen, but Mike Pigg, when I worked with him, he had his greatest year, and I don't remember which year it was, but his greatest year where he won more races and ranked high in most of them and never got hurt is when he didn't do any anaerobic training and just did his whole season aerobically. And Angela Neff, who I'm working with now, is also doing the same thing. Last year she won many races, did well in the ones she didn't win, and was Canadian Triathlete of the Year last year, and didn't do any anaerobic stuff.
Mm-hmm. I'd like to ask you about an observation that I was thinking about as I was reading your book, and that is when I was in track in high school, it seemed that the sprinters were always doing the anaerobic work, and it didn't seem like they ever burnt out, but the endurance runners, the distance runners, were always the ones that were getting injured and sometimes burning out. I'm just wondering, how does that jive with that idea that too much anaerobic could be bad?
Well, it may make sense simply because the endurance runners may have been running with a higher heart rate, and they may have actually been doing anaerobic training as well. But in addition to the anaerobic component of the training, they were doing a lot more volume than the sprinters. Sprinters, I was a sprinter, and I was, as a sprinter, one of the laziest athletes around, because when you're a sprinter, you go out and you jog a couple of laps, and then you do some sprints. And I also did the triple jumps. So you do a few jumps, and you do a little jog to cool down, and that's your workout. The endurance athletes tended to go out and run a few miles, and if they were anaerobic, now they have a component of high volume to their training and anaerobic as well, and that's a recipe for disaster. And actually, that is the combination most deadly for endurance athletes: the fact that they're putting in a lot of miles, in many cases more miles than they really need, and the fact that they're training at a heart rate that's way above their aerobic maximum. So that combination you see in all levels of running even today. And part of it was because in the 60s and 70s, the running boom was exploding, and the environment was ripe for more coaches to come in, and those coaches came from track and field, and with it they brought their track and field work ethic, which was intervals and faster and all that kind of stuff. And so the track and field coaches began to train endurance athletes, and it's just not a good mesh.
Okay. Something you mentioned there is that some endurance athletes might be doing more miles than they need. How do you know what the proper amount of base mileage is? I know we had a guy who does CrossFit endurance. His name is Brian McKenzie on a few weeks ago, and he was saying he has a program that he ran a 100 miler, or several of them actually, with only doing 13-mile trail runs in preparation. Is that crazy, or are some people actually doing more than they need?
Well, I think based on the athletes I saw and have seen since the 70s, most athletes put in more training miles, and I do everything by time, but most athletes train more than they need to. 13 miles as your longest distance for a 100-miler, that's reasonable if you're healthy and if you've built your aerobic system up. You can almost look at the body and say that the human body can do 2 to 3 times more in a race than it can do in training. That doesn't fit with 13 milers and doing 100 milers, although when you start basing it on time and not mileage, you're a lot closer. But I would say that there are two causes, two important training causes of overtraining. And one is too many miles, and the other is too much speed, which is often done within those miles as opposed to the aerobic miles. So I think the phrase I've used often is when in doubt, do less, because you're never going to undertrain, and it's so easy to overtrain.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. If you still have time, I'd like to talk a little bit about your turn to music.
Sure.
So you have a very interesting story. You know, you've gone through chiropractic school, then in coaching endurance athletes, and recently you've turned to music. How did that change come about? And also you've been a physician for the Red Hot Chili Peppers, right?
Yeah, when I was in practice, I had a variety of different types of patients. I did work with athletes quite a bit, but I also was involved in corporate fitness early on, before corporate fitness was even called that. I worked with some patients who were musicians. James Taylor was a patient of mine when I had my New York office. So I had a wide spectrum of patients who did different things, and I treated them similarly. Basically, a musician is an athlete. They have a rigorous schedule when they're on tour. They're performing, and they're spending a couple of hours on stage, and it's not unlike a race. Likewise for an executive. An executive is, the best executives are the healthiest ones, because their brain works better, their body works better, and they have endurance, and their energy doesn't fade out after lunch or whenever. So, but my change into music was another one of those epiphanies. It was another one of those moments. I woke up one day, and I've had music in my head my entire life. I realized it in I must have been 3 or 4 years old when I first realized it, and later on in high school I realized also that it was original music. But it was about 10 years ago that I woke up one day and just decided to be a songwriter. I wanted to take this music in my head and turn it into real songs. And it was one of those epiphanies, and I dropped everything and devoted all my energy to learning how to play guitar, which I didn't really do, learning to play piano, and learning how to write music. And it was quite a change. And when I did that, I realized that I better use my other talent to work with musicians, because that was a way for me to rub elbows with some of the good singer-songwriters out there, and that worked out really well.
Mm-hmm. So were you able to get the Red Hot Chili Peppers off refined carbohydrates?
Well, they, interestingly enough, they had read one of my books before I met them, so they kind of knew what I was all about, and their interest was to get healthier and get more fit over and above where they had gotten by reading the book. And then it was clear that the touring for them was a rigorous. It's a tough grind. And when you're doing 3 or 4 shows a week, for weeks and sometimes months at a time, it's tough, and your health has to be at the top of its game if you're going to perform the best. So they asked me to come on tour with them. I think I did maybe 4 tours with them as their doctor, and worked with a number of other musicians as well, and basically treated them like athletes. It was the same situation. We need to increase fat burning. We need to eat the healthiest foods, exercise aerobically, and so on. So it was very, very interesting, and it was certainly something that helped me understand music better, to see some of the people, especially John Frusciante, the guitarist, and Flea, the bass guitarist. They're musical geniuses, and being around them and talking about music was just an incredible experience.
Well, that's really cool that you took that leap of faith and decided to do something you were passionate about, which was music. And it's pretty incredible that you did that without any previous experience. How's it been going so far?
It's been great. I've got 5 albums. I'm working with Rick Rubin, who is my producer and sort of music mentor. Rick actually was another one who had read one of my books before I knew him. And about 4 days after I decided to be a musician, I got a call through one of my editors or one of my publishers that Rick had called trying to get a hold of me, wanting to consult with me. And so it was an incredible thing to hear that. And I called him back and I said, I don't consult anymore because I just became a songwriter. And we laughed about that, and in the end of that conversation decided that I would help him in his endeavors to be more healthy and fit, and he would help me in my songwriting, and we've been working together ever since. I play a lot of my new songs for him when I spend a lot of time in the Southern California area, so I record most of my music out there and see him often. I'm in touch with him all the time. So it's been a wonderful ride, to say the least.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and Rick Rubin, actually, there was an excerpt that he had written in your book about how he had followed your advice to drop his vegan diet or vegetarian diet and start including some meat and healthier fats and things like that, and he lost something like 130 pounds. Is that correct?
Right. And
has he been able to keep that up?
Oh, he has. He's become a healthy and fit individual, and it's night and day from the way he was. And whenever we get together, we sort of have this tradition now where we go and have a organic grass-fed steak because it was something he would never eat before. And so it's been fun and inspiring, and the music has. We're on our fourth music tour now, music and wellness tour, where I lecture on health topics, often to groups of athletes, and then play music. And, what I realized after I became a musician, I spent several years in L.A. working with Rick, and then realized that music, I realized I hadn't changed careers. I didn't go from being a sports medicine doc or coach to being a songwriter, but I incorporated songwriting into what I was already doing. So the goal of the Music and Wellness Tour is to encourage athletes to put music in their life because it has such a profound effect on health and fitness through the brain that it's often something that's as valuable as good nutrition and proper training. So, but in addition to that, it's really this is the most fun I've ever had in my life.
Well, Phil, it's been great talking to you today. Where would you recommend people go to find out more about your work?
Well, the website, I try to keep active with new articles. When I'm on tour, I can't often put a new article up there weekly, but generally in the course of the year, I have a new article every week that gets posted on the website. And they can go to philmaffetone.com. And there's probably 200 articles on the website right now, many of which were written after the latest book. So it's information that isn't posted anywhere. And a lot of my music is on the website as well, so people can listen to that.
Okay, great. Well, thanks so much for taking the time to talk with me today. I know our listeners will really enjoy it, and it's been a very interesting conversation.
Thank you, Aaron. It's been great.
We all need to sit back and take the lead, and we all know we walk on too damn slow.
You've been listening to another episode of Paleo Runner Podcast. For more information, go to paleorunner.org. Thanks for listening.